a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, listeners. We want to share an upcoming writing retreat that's being hosted by our good friend Annie Tucker. It's by writers and for writers, and it's called Understory. And it's a new writers conference located in beautiful Park City, Utah, and it explores and celebrates the art and craft of storytelling. And Brooke and I will both be there. And so it goes from July 24th to July 27, 2025, and there's going to be like 100 book writers who will have the chance to take more than 30 fiction and nonfiction workshops taught by renowned instructors like Brooke and me, and writers at all stages of their process, from initial concept to complete draft are welcome. Understory is a craft-based conference, and it's intimate, and it's focused on spending as much time outdoors as possible as well. So from now through April 20, I want to ask you to take advantage of Understory's early bird pricing, which includes, this is amazing, it includes a free 30-minute one-on-one editorial consultation with founder Annie Tucker, who I can personally vouch for. And she's going to focus on any questions, concerns, or brilliant ideas you have about your writing. So it's a really wonderful prelude to the conference and more. So for more information, visit www.understoryparkcity.com. So again, that's understoryparkcity.com. And we'll be there this summer, as I mentioned, and we'd love to see you or meet you there and talk about writing.
Hello, culture vultures, reading machines, lit guzzlers, and hype beasts. I'm Brooke, and I am here with my co-pilot, Grant. And Grant, a lot of times we casually throw out the idea that maybe we should do a whole show about a topic or a particular book, but then we don't always follow up on those good ideas because they're just that, good ideas. And we have guests to interview, of course. But when you suggested a few weeks back that maybe we should dedicate a whole show to Miranda July's All Fours, I couldn't help but feel excited about this prospect. And so I realized, in fact, I really wanted to do a whole show about this book for a lot of reasons that we're going to unpack on today's show. And we had an opening in our schedule. And so here we are. We're doing it.
Yeah, a little unusual for us, for sure, and a little intimidating given the subject matter of All Fours being so overtly and extremely sexual. And, I'm from a small town in the Midwest, so we tend not to talk about sex in front of thousands of listeners. I have to say, though, Brooke, that in some ways, I don't think of the sex in the novel so much because I think the sexual impulse and interest spoke so much to a larger life conflict and yearning, and that's the mood I left the novel with. But that said, one reviewer tallied that the narrator masturbates approximately 10 times over the course of the novel, has sex 9 times, and at one point experiences an exquisite moment of intimacy when someone else removes her bloody tampon. So more on that later.
Or not.
Or not, yeah. Read the book. Just read the book. Let's put it that way, actually. Beyond the joy of reading about sex, though, a big part of the reason we went ahead with this show in this format today is because this book is just hitting a crazy zeitgeist moment, at a moment when a lot of people seem to also be talking about Gen X sex. Maybe that's because Gen Xers are like managing editors in places. They want to see this topic explored.
Totally.
Yeah. But it also seems that literally everyone has read this book, which automatically sets a high bar for a book and a book recommendation. And I had one friend who we hadn't spoken in a couple of years, not because we don't like each other. We just live in different parts of the world. And we ended up spending 3 Zoom calls in 1 week talking about this book. And she, in fact, required a whole group of her friends to read it so they could discuss it together. And I know I speak for both of us, Brooke, when I say we think Miranda July she definitely met or exceeded those high expectations for each of us. And before we even get into the book, I remember that you told me that All Fours was our generation's Fear of Flying. And we had Erica Jong on the show a while back, and Fear of Flying, which came out in the 70s, it sold at least 20 million copies. And All Fours just came out in May of last year. And the hardcover sales alone were 200,000. The paperback edition is going to be released soon, which will give it a whole new life and readership. And then the audiobook numbers will come out as well. So Brooke, I'm going to put the question to you. Why has this book reached such a fever pitch? For those who don't know who Miranda July is as well, maybe we start there. And then what is it about the book that makes it a zeitgeist novel for a generation?
Yeah, I mean, good question. So Miranda July has a cult following, first of all. I mean, she is a literary darling. She herself is unique, but her following is unique too. She's written a number of other books before this one, though none of them have been the true breakout that All Fours already is. She's perhaps best known for her film, Me and You and Everyone We Know. You did a Substack post about that, and we had done a Substacking about it. So we have touched upon Miranda in the past. She is prolific insofar as she has done multiple films. She's written a previous novel. She does a lot of short stories. She publishes in the New Yorker. So she's definitely around. People know who she is. I think about her, importantly, she's original. She's fearless in her work, which is part of why she's so beloved also. She's a performance artist and an actress. I read about her work the following. Her style blends vulnerability, quirkiness, emotional intensity, and an off-kilter sense of humor that has earned her a devoted following. So that's her in a nutshell. And you can get a real sense of all that by watching some of her videos on Instagram, which I recommend. A lot of them are designed to make you feel uncomfortable, which is sort of her signature. Like she really does that with her performance art and I would say with her movies and her writing as well. So let's then get to All Fours. I would say it's a perfect storm moment because Miranda July is the perfect person to write a sex book for Gen Xers. You know, she has that aforementioned fearlessness. She's willing to go where others won't. It is at times a very graphic book, but it's also restrained in other ways, surprisingly so. It's full of taboos. You know, she plows right into all the things that we might think about doing, but never would, like leaving her husband and kid for 2 weeks to have an emotional affair right down the street. She wrestles with what women feel they should be getting out of their relationships and their sex lives. Her character sleeps with an older woman. The character's best friend is a lesbian who's having, to my mind, like pretty intense sex with her partner, which the character is then like very explicit about. Then there's a lot in here about longing, desire, feeling sexy. The ways that we do and don't express that, can and can't express that, especially after a certain age. And I mean, I just know that women, even in my circles, ate it up. Apparently some men too, Grant, because I know you were really moved by the book. And so I'd love to hear your take on it. What about it moved you? And do you think more men should be reading All Fours?
Yeah, just the last question. Let's just say yes.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating book because I found actually people, they had a very either or taste for it. It's an all or nothing book, I guess, which is a sign of something that's important and that you should pay attention to. And I think the book struck women and men in that vein to some degree. Like one of my women friends got so mad at a couple of her book club friends for not liking it that she thought about quitting the book club and her friendship with them. It was like, talk about an either or relationship with a book. I sympathized. I think she's still in the book club though. Conversely though, I think more men definitely kind of bristled at it and felt threatened by it. And I had one friend joke that he wasn't going to let his wife read it because if she did, it would disrupt their marriage too much. He was joking, but still. And while I was reading it, I wondered if it should actually be required reading for all couples. But then I wondered if most couples could actually truly handle the conversations that might come out of it. I gave my copy to my daughter, by the way. So my wife, Heather, is next in the family to read it. So I'm looking forward to those conversations. And I joked with Simone, who's just 20, that it was a kind of handbook to middle-aged. So to prepare for that. Yeah. So I was with a group of men recently, though. And one of them asked for recommendations of contemporary novels. And these were all thoughtful, sensitive guys, so I recommended All Fours. But I was surprised that two of them who took up or read the book or started reading it, I guess, they ended up pillaring the novel over email. And I was actually offended by how much they hated the novel. And I thought it revealed just something really bad about where some men are these days, even the liberal guys, because their reactions seemed beyond any novel critique. Their animosity seemed deeper than that. Mm-hmm. To answer your question, though, personally, I love the novel the way I love an Annie Ernaux story, because Ernaux is noted for writing about really tough female subjects with unflinching honesty. And, it took on a difficult and often embarrassing subject matter. All Fours did, especially since the main character resembles Miranda July so much. And it did so in just like frank and surprising ways. And I should say that I read it on my 60th birthday road trip to Death Valley, but I wasn't done with it on the way back. So on the last leg of my trip, I found an excuse to stop for the night. And I spent the night at the Lost Hills Motel 6 just so I could finish the book in a hotel room. And
so appropriate.
Exactly. It was so amazingly appropriate because the first act of the novel, just has this cocoon, this dreamy hotel room that Miranda July created. So, the reading experience for me was just among my most memorable and special ever. So, Brooke, I know you have a personal connection to Miranda July, so I'm curious about whether or how that affected your reading experience.
Yeah, well, my personal connection to her, yes, is through her parents. I worked for them for 5 years, my first job in publishing, and I'm a couple years younger than her. So since I started that job when I was 23, I always felt that her parents did take on kind of a parental role with me in that job. It's certainly not that I ever thought of her in a sisterly way, but I was close to her parents during those years at North Atlantic Books, which is the publishing company they founded in the 70s. And I met Miranda a handful of times at the office at that time. I went to her screening of Me and You and Everyone We Know, which came out the year after I left North Atlantic. And of course, Miranda July grew up here in Berkeley. Knowing her parents certainly made me hesitant to read the book at first, I will say, for lots of reasons, just that kind of proximity. And so I had it on my long list. But what happened, of course, over the course of the summer was I was aware of the book, of course, it was getting increasingly more attention. But then I don't think it reached that real fever pitch we're talking about until the fall, at least in my circles. And that's when everyone started to ask me if I had read it yet. And so I was like, yes, I'm going to get to it. I'm going to get to it. But then what tipped me over the edge was that I went to a holiday party, and here were all these middle-aged moms, of middle schoolers like my son. And the first woman I started talking to says, have you read all fours? I finally was like, all right, I'm buying the book. So I got the audiobook, Grant, because sometimes, as I've talked about lots of times, that's the only way I can get through something new. I have to say, I wish I had read it because Miranda reads her own book and her voice is very particular. It's kind of, I would say, husky and scratchy, I guess. And so it wasn't so much that I didn't like it as much as I just couldn't get into it being a novel. With her reading it, I was in memoir land. And I know that a lot of things in the book are true. Miranda's own child is non-binary. Her own grandmother and aunt really did commit suicide in the way that she writes about in All Fours. It's not like these things are family secrets, by the way. Miranda has shared them in interviews. But according to her, this is kind of interesting. Her grandmother and her aunt committed suicide at the age of 55, obviously consecutively, not at the same time, because they found it unbearable to see their looks go. I have to say I had never heard that particular lens from Miranda's dad, but obviously that's a very intense legacy to inherit. And then going on to similarities, Grant, you and I talked about this before, the character in the book is quasi-famous, the way that Miranda does. And so the way she writes about her own fame is interesting. She's conscious of it, ambivalent in some ways, superior to others in other ways. And she's honest. This is the character, not always likable. But that's what makes the book so gripping, but given my immersion in memoir, the whole experience was certainly more thought about the blurring of lines between memoir and fiction, which we've discussed, but I think we're just going to keep talking about it because it's more so all the time. Don't you think?
Totally. And, I was even thinking that the beginning of the novel was dealing with that very question of what's real life and what's fiction and how to deal with it on the page. And so I think it's interesting that I feel like the line between fiction and memoir is as blurry as it's ever been in literary history, I think. And authors have always leveraged their lives and the lives of those around them in fiction, but rarely with the directness and the kind of confusing boundaries we see today. And some fiction is described as autofiction, to label it as not quite fiction and not quite memoir. But I know that some authors don't like it when their work of fiction is labeled this way. I'm thinking of Jenny Ofel with her book Department of Speculation, for example. But then so many authors actually court that label. And I'm thinking of writers like Ocean Vuong and Rachel Cusk. And in the case of Rachel Cusk, I feel like I'm literally in her head, not even in a story per se, at least with her trilogy that she came out with a couple years ago. I actually love the parts of the story where Miranda July, the real person, shine through really brightly. And I love how she walked through the world as a minor celebrity and kept that was one of her lenses. And that's how she described herself. And I'm curious about that decision because so often writers will offer a somewhat kind of thin veil of identity. The writer character becomes an artist or a musician, in other words, but everyone sees through it. I listened to Terry Gross's interview with Miranda July, and unfortunately, she missed this great opportunity to explore identity in real life and identity on the page. And I'm going to read this part of the transcript of their interview, Brooke, because I know you also thought Terry Gross missed an important moment here. So Miranda gives her an opening, and then Terry doesn't take it, unfortunately. So Terry Gross says, imagine me speaking like Terry Gross.
Good luck.
Yeah, I'm not going to do my Terry Gross impression, but another time maybe. So Terry Gross says, there's a line in your book where you're buying something from an older woman and you think about how you sometimes really hate old women. And then Miranda says, we're going to have to decide. Are we saying you? And Terry says, oh, I'm sorry, the character. And then Miranda laughs and says, I mean, we can get into that. To which Terry Gross says, yeah. And Miranda says, but, the narrator is saying, yeah. But Terry Gross leaves it there, that again, blurry line between the narrator and Miranda July. And Miranda July, I think, really does kind of want to talk about it. And instead, Terry Gross starts obsessing about Miranda having worked in the peep shows when she was younger. And the interview just, sort of spirals from there. But Brooke, I'm curious, did you find other interviews online or anything where Miranda July spoke to this blurring of life and fiction?
I didn't find specific interviews where she gets into it, but I'm sure there are. Mostly the online reviews refer to the book as autofiction. And the Guardian reviewer wrote that July, tangles explicitly with reality across mediums and pushes autofiction to new limits, revealing how good this genre is at questioning reality. So, certainly people are seeing that in it. One of the things I most loved about the book is the way that Miranda's protagonist fantasizes, actually, and it's actually quite exquisite to read or listen to, as the case might be, because she trips into these flights of fancy. She scenarioizes, she imagines, she has these full-blown self-fulfilling sexual escapades, by the things that she conjures up in her own mind. Clearly, Miranda has a very rich imagination, but to bring that to the page, embodied as it is by her character is really wonderful. I also liked the book because I felt a lot of things. I was bewildered and embarrassed at times, the aforementioned bloody tampon scene, for sure, one of those. I laughed out loud. I was surprised and in awe. It resonated. It didn't resonate. I related to the protagonist at times, and then I didn't sometimes. There were these things that the character does that are outrageous and pushing boundaries. But as I mentioned earlier, one of Miranda July's signature things is to make people uncomfortable. And not a lot of people position their work in that space because it's also uncomfortable to do that. I was thinking about a friend I have who thrives off of uncomfortable situations. And so he does things that are designed to make people uncomfortable, and he puts himself and other people in uncomfortable situations often. And I have witnessed this a lot, right? Because it's a close friend of mine. And sometimes I love it and sometimes I hate it. But it's always kind of thrilling and titillating in a way, because it makes you feel something. And I think for Miranda July, this is really centered to her performance art. I have watched a lot of her stuff and I have felt decidedly squirmy. I think a few things about that, like more power to her. I couldn't do what she does. And I don't think very many people feel the freedom to do what she does because a lot of us are bound up inside of social, conformity and norms that are not only societally imposed, they're imposed by self and by family, and having known her parents, like, I will say she's encouraged to be, very artistic and to explore in that way. And I think not a lot of families have, that kind of openness, which is very cool. And part of her work is just an examination of breaking free of all of that, which is why it's also very inherently feminist. And All Fours, for me was not a surprising book, that she would come up with something like this. But Grant, I do want to talk a little bit about the dancing and about Davy, because when we talked about the book, you were intrigued by the dancing and the performative nature of this affair that is never consummated. So what drew you into the storyline?
Yeah, Davy is a kind of classical American character now, I think, in a lot of ways. I even had a friend who claimed that she was the Davy in the relationship she was in, which I thought was interesting. But never consummated is a key part of this, very highly sexually charged, emotionally charged relationship. And it's just kind of weird to use never consummated and highly sexual charged in the same sentence. But it was just a unique, strange, and compelling love affair that I don't really think has been explored in this way on the page. I think Miranda July very consciously didn't have them have sex or be too physical in conventional ways for the reason that she wanted to show this deeper yearning, in both of them, but especially her, and this deeper dissatisfaction that her character was experiencing. And the ways that fantasy itself is a sexually compelling realm, and how perhaps the best sex is actually in moments of anticipation and hope. So I have to give a little bit of a spoiler alert here, but to set the stage, just an hour into the narrator's road trip from LA to New York, what's behind this is that she locks eyes across her window with Davy, who's this handsome attendant at a small town garage. And because of this, she decides to stay the night there. And then, she gets obsessed with Davy, and she ends up squandering the $20,000 that's supposed to take her to New York City for a grand time with her friends. And she commissions Davy's wife, Claire, to redesign her crappy roadside hotel room. Very strange, but it's this kind of, I don't know, it's this fantasy world that's so amazing. And it's this oasis. And so Miranda July's character stays in this oasis of a hotel room that smells like a tonka bean for the 3 weeks of her vacation. And then she's joined, there's all this sexual tension, but she's joined every afternoon by Davy, with whom she discovers this mutually but unconsummated passion. And he turns out to be this amazing airborne dancer. And through dancing, they find forms of intimacy that finally, make life seem real. And it's because they don't have sex that it's also sexually charged, because, every accidental brush of skin, sends them, kind of spiraling into desire. And since they can't have sex, their almost sex is even hotter. That's what's interesting too. And when the narrator isn't with Davy, she masturbates to fantasies of him quite often. So it was interesting for me because I have followed Miranda July on Instagram for years. And I don't know when this started, but several years ago, she started doing all these intense, very revealing dances. And now I can't help but think that some version of this novel was taking place in real life as a result, because they were really crazy dances. I had to stop and watch them. And so the first third of the book in the hotel room, for me, was overwhelmingly the best part of the book. And I've heard that from others. So it's interesting, just in a narrative sense, that the book hits its peak so early. And then the narrator has to reckon with the aftermath of that rather, ecstatic experience for the rest of the book. So returning home, she has to make sense of the rest of her life. And she's somewhat estranged from her husband. And she realizes that her menopause holds a reality that challenges the fantasies that are kind of central to her life. And she becomes haunted by this chart that I think a lot of women are talking about these days in the novel. She discovers it online, and it's called Sex Hormones Over a Lifespan. And she interprets the chart to mean that she only has a very brief window left in her life during which she might experience sexual desire. And part of her reckoning also includes what you mentioned earlier, Brooke, that her grandmother and aunt both killed themselves in their 50s. So the novel, in many ways is about how can the narrator avoid destroying her marriage and her relationship with her child while still pursuing, the sexual and creative freedom that her countdown clock requires, and if so, how? And I think that's a question for all of us in the book, actually. So on that note, Brooke, the book is also being billed as a menopause novel. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And would you even characterize it as such?
Yeah, I think what's going on is that the character is in perimenopause and she talks about it a lot, so people have called it the first great perimenopause novel. I would love to know what Miranda July thinks of that, because I truly doubt that's what she set out to achieve here per se. I think the book is about sex and desire and self-invention or self-reinvention first and foremost. And it happens to be through the lens of a 45-year-old protagonist who's aging and who's in perimenopause, ergo, right? I think that's it. And I have talked to women my age who've read the book, and what they most gravitate toward is the honest conversation and depiction of sex and desire. And by the time you're in your mid to late 40s, a lot of women have been married for up to 20 years. A lot of women have kids. A lot of women do not feel desirable to themselves, or within the context of their relationships. And probably not many are having as much sex as they'd like to, in part because they've all had all the sex they could ever want to have with their life partners, probably. And I have had conversations with actually a couple of my closest friends who've been married a while and have sort of expressed this kind of thing, and that Miranda's book explores sex not just explicit sex as we've been talking about, but ways of being sexual, like through the dance and through this unconsummated sex, having a sexual experience that isn't quote unquote cheating is kind of provocative. And then the book is also a little unhinged, and I mean that in a good way. Like the character is a little unhinged, and maybe that's how a lot of us feel as we're approaching 50. I guess I would say it's more of a midlife crisis novel, frankly. I think it provokes one to consider the crazy ways that you might blow up your life if you wanted to, and it actually wouldn't be that hard. And I have to imagine that a lot of middle-aged women fantasize or mind trip about getting up and leaving.
Yeah.
Just walking out the door, right? And having some wild, insane road trip where they renovate a hotel room to the tune of 10 grand and have an emotional affair with someone 15 years younger, right?
Sounds good to me.
It is. I get why it's such a popular book. Hey, it's escapism fiction and sex fiction, desire fiction, totally crazy, but actually not all that crazy.
I agree that it's primarily a midlife crisis novel, and I think Miranda July is very conscious of that in the writing of it, and she even makes kind of gestures and jokes and comments in the book in that direction. For example, she overtly compares what she's doing to the whole tradition of men cheating with younger women, both in literature and life, and she's very conscious of what she's doing and how it wouldn't be exactly perceived the same way if she were a man. Mm-hmm. So, Brooke, I'm curious because I am very interested in this narrative structure of reaching this incredible peak in the first third, and so I'm interested in what you thought of the last 2/3 of the book, where she's creating her new self, because this really is the kind of deep meaning of the book, the non-fantasy part, and she strikes an agreement with her husband that they can see other people. But that doesn't really deliver anything close to what she had with Davy. And maybe the obvious message is you can't have that for your whole life. So all of life seems a little dreary, even when she gets in a long-term relationship with another woman. And the relationship with Davy, it just held more because it existed so much in fantasy and anticipation, which is, Miranda July's preferred state to live in, I think. And it's odd because when her new girlfriend dumps her pretty coldly, she has to nurse a broken heart with her husband and child in the same room, like at family dinners. And it's odd and somehow a little disturbing, I guess. I don't know why. Just uncomfortable, maybe. And I guess I'm not sure if or how her character could become happier. She has open communication and an open relationship with her husband, but the book ends with what I took as a certain disappointed air. We're left with our aging bodies, in other words, yearning for something more. And I guess that's life, a failing body and yearning. So how did you view the ending, Brooke?
Well, I appreciated the lesbian relationship part toward the end of the book. I will say that. But there's a certain desperation there that did, as you said, make me feel uncomfortable. Like she's kind of desperate in that relationship in a way that is kind of hard to read sometimes. But also the nature of a new relationship, versus a comfortable one that is known. So she's exploring all these different ways in which we love and are loved, confident in ourselves, and completely consumed with self-doubt. Even someone who's a minor celebrity, right? Who in some ways, like she goes around like looking down at people. But then when she gets into this relationship with this woman, she's completely like one down with her, so it's very fascinating to see those dynamics. And I don't want to spoil the ending, so I don't want to, speak to the end, but I am happy that Davy resurfaces. I won't say that the ending was completely satisfying to me, but I think the fact that she doesn't leave her husband is actually a nice counterbalance to the standard divorce stories that we see out there. Just that she chose a different door for her protagonist.
Yeah, definitely interesting. Before we close, Brooke, I'm curious, can a publisher design this kind of success? Do you think that Riverhead knew just how huge a book this was going to be?
I don't. I think you can have a book like this and it checks all the boxes. Miranda July is already a literary darling with a cult following. The book is sexy and it's about sex, and sex obviously sells. Interesting. I went and looked for it. There was no deal posted on Publishers Marketplace, where you can sometimes find out how much a publisher paid for a book or if it went to auction. No, not there. So we don't have those details. Miranda is very public, with all kinds of things, obviously her work, but her many other like multimedia ways of being online. And so on her Substack, she has an ongoing All Fours group chat for everyone, not a book club per se, but like a place where readers can talk about their lives. And then she had some sort of interactive experience where she encouraged readers to submit their own videos on her website, which is interesting. And then she simultaneously published the book in the UK. So it's all very coordinated, but still, unless you are a publisher and you have like Barbara Streisand or Prince Harry or Britney Spears, the publishing world really cannot anticipate this kind of success. Like Miranda is famous, but not that kind of famous. And then this is a novel. It's not a memoir. And Grant, it was just announced last week that Miranda July is a finalist for the Women's Prize for Fiction. So good timing on our part. Like this is not only a zeitgeist book and a book of a generation, it's a very award-winning book. And it's quite amazingly written. It's very readable and even very listenable. So we encourage it clearly.
Yeah, it was nominated for a National Book Award as well. It didn't win, but It was nominated, which is a huge, huge thing. And, it's just been such a long time since I've read something so consuming. And it's probably the last novel I'm going to rent a hotel room to finish, maybe. I hope not. It was such a great experience.
Or hope so. I don't know. Motel 6.
I have a rare affection for Motel 6 that my family makes fun of me for. But yeah, so anyway, we recommend that you not only read All Fours, but read it with others and perhaps in a hotel room, because we're going to, you're going to want to talk about it with others. That's what I find so interesting about the novel. People want to talk about it after they read it. And it was definitely fun to talk about this with you today, Brooke. And I hope we can take the occasional break when a zeitgeist novel is published and do the same again. And on that note, I want to extend an invitation to Miranda July, who I know is listening right now, to join us on Right Minded and to talk about that autofiction blurry line, if nothing more. So we'll ask the question Terry Gross failed to ask. That's how we're going to build the show and more. So that's why we're here, to ask and honor questions about writing, both the ones that are asked and not asked. We'll ask them. So please keep tuning in to Right Minded every week. We'll be here.